All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to our mini AMA on rest. My name is Maria Plessel. I'm the executive director of MiniStar. We're a nonprofit organization in the Minnesota tech community that puts on a lot of events around town, and this series is one of them. So we do this twice a month where we bring on subject matter experts to answer your questions in real time live. And we're really, really excited to be joined by Lori and Sarah today. I'll be introducing them, but first I just want to go through a little bit of some housekeeping items. First off, we want to know and make sure, most importantly, can you hear us? Can you hear us okay? So let us know that by introducing yourselves in the chat. The chat function, if you're on a desktop, is in the lower right-hand corner. You can ask questions in there. We'll be reviewing that throughout the session today. There's also a Ask a Question feature at the bottom. Hey, Jeremy. All right. Jeremy can hear us. Fantastic. I'm a data analyst for Aperture Health. Welcome. Perfect. Hey, Teresa. Oh, hello from Boston. I lived in Boston for 3 years. That's wonderful. I love Boston. Hi, Wendy. Executive assistant at OST. Fantastic. Hi, Amy. Amy's in the Twin Cities. We're happy to have you. Yeah, so as you're introducing yourself in the chat, the other one I wanted to mention is the Ask a Question feature. You can utilize either the chat or the Ask a Question, doesn't matter, we'll be monitoring both, to ask questions of our amazing panelists. We're going to be talking about a ton of topics. We already have gotten really excited talking about it behind the scenes when it comes to rest, when it comes to, we talked about anxiety and depression, we talked about sleep, we talked about addiction. So there's a lot of pieces to this conversation, and we want to inform it based on you and what you want to hear. So you definitely use those throughout this session. Trying to think what else, other housekeeping items. Yeah, I think we can kind of get started here. I'll introduce our amazing panelists here, and then I'll let them introduce themselves a little bit, and then we'll jump in. We have a few questions that are already lined up, and then, but yeah, you put your questions down in the chat as we go along. So first off, we have Lori. Lori, you want to do a little wave?
Hey, everyone.
So Lori, if you don't know her, strong ally for the recovery community, advocate for individuals and families that are struggling with substance use and mental health disorders. So she's a recovery coach, a RISE interventionist, and a peer recovery specialist. And then we have Sarah. So Sarah started her career in sleep medicine in 2006. She's the founder and CEO of Sleep Health Specialists, which provides sleep education to local businesses and corporations. So Sarah also sat on the board of directors for the Minnesota Sleep Society. You also might catch her on WCCO. Is it monthly that you do this, Sarah? That's awesome. So kind of the Health Watch news segment, you can catch her there. So we're really, really excited to talk with both of them. But why don't we hear from Lori? Do you want to go first? A little bit about yourself and kind of how you got to the space?
Yeah, definitely. No, thanks. And thanks for having us here. I'm really excited to talk about this with everybody today. So yeah, you know, a large part of my career actually was spent in the tech space and working with startups and companies for about 25 years. And then I have had what was kind of called the lifequake moment, and it really pivoted me into the space of mental health, and maybe we'll get into that a little bit. But my main focus now is really primarily helping families, or really anybody that has a loved one who's experiencing substance use and co-occurring mental health disorders. And basically what that means is I coach them on ways to really step through those situations with empathy and compassion and kindness, and help them do away with these ideas of detaching with love or let them hit rock bottom. And so a lot of communications coaching, just how can we show up for our person and do it in a way that makes them feel honored and heard and seen.
Fantastic. And how about you, Sarah?
Well, yes, I've worked in sleep for a very long time now. I started after getting my degree in polysomnography, which is sleep studies. I started doing sleep studies overnight, very hypocritically, diagnosing patients with sleep disorders. I then became an adjunct professor at Minneapolis College, where I taught the sleep medicine program. And now I have this small business where I work with companies and corporations to teach classes on sleep for tired employees. So I've had a lot of different roles in sleep over the years, but it's an important conversation to have. And I know this because for years, when I would tell people what I did for a living, complete strangers would tell me very intimate details about their lives, hoping to get some help. So it really has shown me for a very long time that sleep is a conversation that needs to be had more, especially after now with this pandemic. The concept of sleep and rest and how it does correlate to our mental well-being is very important.
I mean, I think that's the perfect segue. One of the questions that we had was talking about, these issues, whether it's mental health, whether it's substance use, sleep, rest, have always been kind of omnipresent, right? But I feel like, what I'm hearing is that, of course, the pandemic just exacerbates all of these things, right? And I'm curious if both of you can kind of talk about, both from Lori, maybe in that, mental health and addiction space, which, I've seen articles about it, just like the pandemic has had on that. But also Sarah, from the, that sleep and rest stage, would, the effect that the pandemic and mental health and all of these things going together in what sounds like a little bit of a perfect storm. So one of you want to kind of start touching on that?
Yeah. Well, I can definitely kind of start with, the stats. I mean, they're not pretty. I think we've probably all read many, many articles over the past year about how our mental health has been impacted, given everything that 2020 and even 2021 has brought into our lives. Given that I'm, closely related to the substance use space, we've definitely seen a pretty dramatic rise in terms of substance use behaviors. And, I think it's important to note that those behaviors make sense to people that are choosing a substance like that to cope. Many of us maybe choose to go for a run or do yoga or paint a picture or, get together online for a support group. Some people choose substances as a way to cope, to escape the pain and anxiety that they're feeling from a lot of this trauma that's been introduced into our lives. But we've seen what has gone from maybe some casual drinking into high risk drinking. And so there are certain people that have, escalated into a situation where it has now become problematic for them. I mean, in Minnesota alone, we saw that even just preventable overdose deaths have risen as high as they've ever been in our state. So we're seeing some really, really scary situations out there for people. But, and I think just even anecdotally, I've heard from people that, I can't even get in to see a therapist. So first of all, consider yourself lucky if you actually have access to a therapist, because it can be really hard right now for people to find the help they need. So, these are things too that, aren't probably going to go away in the year. There's been a lot of studies that have shown that when there are these big traumatic events in our culture, that the residual effects we're seeing from them, whether it's through PTSD, depression, anxiety, and other mental health disorders, and substance use rates rise and continue to stay that way for quite a while. Of course, that's why it's so important to find ways that we can start to address some of these situations in our lives.
Yeah, and Sarah, do you see the effect happening on sleep disturbances and everything?
All so closely connected, and it's really kind of that vicious cycle that came from that perfect storm. So when we were thinking about even with mental health and the correlation with sleep or sleep deprivation, it was bad before. In 2018, the World Health Organization classified sleep deprivation as an epidemic. This is something that nationally was literally killing people, and then we jumped from an epidemic to a pandemic. We had no break, and even though we have what people would consider more access to sleep now, we don't have a commute anymore. We could take a nap at home if we wanted to. It seems like we are able to get more sleep, but neurologically we cannot, because of the increased stress, anxiety, depression, everything associated with this trauma of this year. So that, coupled with the fact that human beings do not neurologically do well with uncertainty. Uncertainty is so hard for us. We're not supposed to live in extended periods of uncertainty. We are supposed to be able to find solutions, go down the problem-solving route. And when we don't have the answers that we need to solve our own problems, it does cause those hormones that are major players in depression and anxiety to increase. And all these things are regulated during sleep. So we have this heightened anxiety and depression, which leads to poorer sleep. And then that poor sleep leads to the deregulation of those hormones that increases depression and anxiety.
Yeah, and one of the questions that just came through from Wendy was around, some of these stats that we're talking about. There have been published articles about it, and she was saying that she'd love to share like a one-sheeter info with the company, and just wondering if maybe it could be after this, we'll send an email, but you all probably have access to articles or documents that she could probably share around she was identifying the trauma that we're facing a year after dealing with the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as a disclaimer, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a counselor, so I'm very clear about wanting to stay in my lane. But I do want to talk a little bit about, this idea of big T trauma and little T trauma, which is well researched throughout the mental health industry. And so big T traumas, are one of those things that most people would think is very traumatic. Those are things like physical or sexual abuse, violent events, the unexpected death of a loved one. So, big kind of earth-shaking, earth-shattering life events that people would think about. Little T traumas are usually a little more subtle, chronic in nature, and tend to build up over time. So these could be things like maybe being continually bullied at school. It could be losing something that's important to you, whether that's a job, it could be the loss of a promotion, loss of a friendship. So even not having somebody in your life that's empathetic toward you can actually be a cause of little T trauma. And it's important to remember that trauma is highly individualized. So one person's little T trauma could be another person's big T trauma. But I think we could probably all agree on the fact that the last year, with COVID, with the racial injustice, with everything that we've been dealing with in some way, shape, or form is traumatic to us. And again, it's very individualized. So we have to take a look at, who we are, where we live, what access to resource we have, all of these things. But we are going to see the effects of this for a really long time. So identifying that trauma, and even in the workplace, recognizing that we have all been through multiple different levels of trauma is really important, just to recognize that, so that we can start to show up for people in ways that are authentic and help them, sort this out.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good point. And I think, to piggyback off that, when you're talking about little T trauma too, that's not to say that is minimizing anything. When you talk about, EMDR or other therapies that are really getting at trauma, what I've, seen happen is that sometimes those little T traumas are a little bit trickier to tackle because you're dealing with chronic issues, not dealing with one car accident or something that you're looking to unpack. You're unpacking, like years of bullying or years of being a family member of someone who is, using substances. And so, but, you're touching on something that is one of the questions that had come up before. So, when we're talking about trauma or we're talking about crisis, someone that's in crisis, for both of you, what strategies would you recommend to someone that's in crisis or having a traumatic response versus someone who is experiencing moderate levels of anxiety and depression? Like, how would you parse those two out?
I would start if somebody is in crisis, because we always want to consider safety. If somebody is in crisis, definitely finding somebody to get them help. In an acute situation, maybe that's even calling, 911 or getting in touch with mental health experts through, the SOS type hotline. So that's really important. And I think too, if there are individuals that are dealing with that, finding therapy, finding a therapist that can really help them work through that, and so that they have access to somebody. And now I know that's not possible for everybody. And so what I'd also, recommend to people is just even starting with who are the safe people in your life that you can go to? What are the safe spaces that you have access to? Because one of the things that can be really hard in mental health and substance use situations is a lot of times these are disorders of isolation. And so the importance of making sure that we're in connection with other people, especially during these times, is really important. So that resource network around you is crucial. And I'm so glad we live in a state that has some amazing, amazing resources on the mental health front and on the recovery front. And so if anybody, I'd love connecting people with those resources when they need it. So I would say, reach out to me if you have questions on that front, and I'm happy to help. But that would be, some of my recommendations off the bat. How about you, Sarah?
That's what I was going to say. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, because we are seeing we're seeing spikes in a lot of these things, but we're also seeing people who have never experienced, regulation issues, sleep regulation, dysregulation, or anxiety or depression. We're seeing people who maybe are experiencing these things for the first time, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's what's hard too is, a lot of reasons people don't reach out, and, maybe you've all read about this as well, but just the pure shame and stigma that's associated with this. And Sarah and I were talking about this a little bit earlier, which might be a good segue for that, Sarah. But just, gosh, I'm embarrassed to tell anybody. I don't know what to say. I have to appear strong for my family. Whatever the reasons are true inhibitors. So that shame and stigma, I think, is something that, we're trying to break down as a whole, which is really important. And if anything, the events that we've been through this year hopefully have opened up people to just recognizing that, this is a really important component of our wellness. We do, I think, a pretty good job in our communities about, physical wellness and things like that. But the areas of, emotional wellness, of sleep wellness, those haven't really seen the light of day. And maybe now we're at this place where we can start talking about them.
Yes, the whole concept of shame is really interesting, and it's a very sad part of everything else that we're going through, to have that be on top of everything, feeling guilty or shameful for either needing help or recognizing that things have changed. So I've definitely heard that a lot as well in this last year, people saying, I've never had problems sleeping and now I can't. There is that just feeling of I'm doing something wrong without understanding that, again, this collective trauma that we're all going through is so much more impactful than we would ever have known, because this is our first pandemic. It's not going well. So I definitely think that whole point of communication with others, the circle of trust, the people that you have in your life that you can speak with, people are going to be very surprised once you start opening up and reaching out to hear similar stories from this circle of trust, because we're all going through it. So this shame is completely unnecessary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. We've touched on connection, and during a pandemic that can be really challenging sometimes. Now with things opening up a little bit more with the vaccines and everything, I wonder if that'll change things. But for a long time, connection has been virtual, right? And so I'm curious, both of your thoughts on social media. Is it good or is it bad?
We could probably talk all hour on that, right?
So from a neurological standpoint, social media is terrible. It is really, really hard. It's that whole, comparison is the thief of joy. And when we do see others living this life, despite the fact that we know that it is manufactured and fake, we do still compare our lives to it, causing more problems. Not to mention the actual technological aspect that is ruining our sleep. Oh, we had no idea what we were doing when we so thoroughly implemented technological devices into every single aspect of our lives. Zoom calls all day, and then after supper we've got Netflix, and then before bed we play Candy Crush. All of this technology, this is a problem that our grandparents didn't have. We have to figure out a way now to operate in a healthy way with all of this. And it's just, it has not been, that education has not been given to us as a community. In fact, it's almost kind of interesting, even with Apple releasing their admission that night mode or night shift doesn't really block as much blue light as they make it seem, that kind of stuff. So yeah, social media for a lot of different reasons can be negative, but at the same time, like I always say with this pandemic, do what makes you happy. We're all trying to get through this however we can. And if scrolling through Instagram memes brings you joy, fine, do that for a little bit, but wear some blue light blocking glasses.
Yeah, even personally, I go back and forth on this. Just even recently, I haven't been on Facebook as much as I used to be. It just there's kind of this feeling of exhaustion. I think a lot of us are experiencing. So definitely seen a lot of back and forth in myself and even just amongst my friends. The other thing is, we're wired for connection. So especially because we've been in this environment where we haven't been able to be physically connected, I actually think it's probably been a lifeline for a lot of people. And of course, I will always espouse that it is never a replacement for human connection. So we have to keep that in mind too about, what we're building online. The other thing I just want to talk about, let's talk about dopamine for a minute. So, when we do things, when we have behaviors that feel good, whether that's getting a hug from somebody, whether that's, seeing pictures that make us happy, going for a walk, whatever it is, there's lots of different things that we do to feel good. And so the way our behavior works, reinforcements, we want to do those things again. Well, social media is like that too. And, the studies out there show that every time somebody likes our, Facebook pictures from vacation or, cute puppies or whatever it is, we see that and our brain lights up because we're getting a dopamine release each time we get one of those likes or comments. And so that is a very rewarding behavior for us. So we tend to want to do that more and more. And that's how a lot of our behaviors works. If you bring it back to substance use, that's why, that substance gives people, whatever it is, a feeling of relief, a feeling that they can show up, a feeling that they can be funnier. And so that dopamine is very, very rewarding in our brains, and social media is right up there with that too. I think, when it becomes damaging is obviously when we start this comparison, this thief of joy and looking for approval, maybe in what other people are expressing, is where it can start to get a little dicey, I think.
Yeah, I think that you really hit on something where it can be such a double-edged sword, right? There are certainly places for when you talk about communities where there still is some shame or stigma, whether it's, people experiencing infertility, right? And they don't feel comfortable sharing it with, their feed or their family, but they can go on, there's Facebook groups for whatever, right? So I think there's definitely a place for that, but it is, I told my sister just did one of those, like, I'm giving up social media for a month. And she's like, my mental health and my sleep has never been better. So yeah, that's a tricky one. Just a reminder to folks to definitely drop your questions in the chat or the ask a question section on really anything. We're taking it all, anything having to do with mental health or sleep or rest or anything, you name it. We are here for it. One of the questions that came up beforehand, and Sarah, I'm curious your take on this, because we talked a little bit about just like the immense importance of sleep, right? The immense importance of how it, affects just everything in your body and your mental well-being. I was chatting with someone and, they experienced depression and they were like, can there be too much sleep? Like, is there a balance that we're looking for, or can someone, is there such a thing as too much sleep?
So that's a tricky one because, metabolically and individualized, we're just very different. Your reason for sleeping so much is really what we would be more concerned about. So in general, no. If we are sleeping a lot, our body needs it. That's our body's way of saying, something's wrong. Our fatigue is an indicator for needing more rest, and we should definitely listen to that. The problem really comes with not understanding the importance of those extra hours of sleep when it comes to how our body is able to operate. So our sleep as a baseline is considered the third pillar of health: diet, exercise, sleep. But what we learn about is diet and exercise from a very young age. If you want to be healthy, you have to work out. You got to eat healthy foods from the food pyramid. But we don't learn anything about our sleep, despite the fact that, quite honestly, it's the most important one. Obviously, I appear biased, but it is. If you don't work out, you may become obese. You won't be healthy, but you'll be alive. If you eat McDonald's every day, again, you'll keep living, but you'll be not as healthy. Sleep, you can only go 6 days without REM sleep before you'll die. It is so vitally important to our well-being, and we know nothing about it. So when it comes to oversleeping, again, fatigue, that's an indicator that something's wrong. You really do need to be sleeping. Now, That being said, there are different ways to wake up more restful that a lot of us are missing. When we think about oversleeping or sleeping too long, a lot of times we're waking up from a certain stage of sleep that makes us feel more groggy. So it may feel like sleeping that long kind of time was too much for your body, but in reality, you are still sleep deprived. You're working off that sleep deprivation, and you probably just came out of REM sleep where your muscles were paralyzed. Again, there's just so much about our sleep that most people don't know. So it kind of will confuse yourself with, I just slept too much because I don't feel great. But that not great feeling is probably for a lot of other different reasons. But sorry if that was long-winded, but
no, it's great.
You really should be looking at your nighttime sleep and the quality of that to ensure the daytime hours going well. And with going well, we think about all of the aspects of our waking hours, our motivation, our perception, our judgment, our health, our productivity. All of these things can be positively or negatively impacted by how you sleep.
Yeah, I that is, wow. Yeah, there's so much there. Like, I think about that, and what you were saying at the core of the why behind the too much sleep, right? Is it a disassociation? Is it, are you just that exhausted, right? And I think that, wow, oh my gosh, you're just a wealth of knowledge on sleep. So one of the things that came up before was people having questions that are managers, that are, people leaders in their company, and really wanting to say, like, I want to create an environment where I'm supporting my team and getting enough rest, but how do I do that? What are kind of some of the first steps that you would recommend to people managers?
You want to start with that, Sarah? Or do you want me to?
You go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I think when people are in the workplace and there's already kind of a maybe fear, or just maybe a little bit of anxiety around how do I bring up a topic that's not normally talked about in the workplace. That's where that shame and stigma comes in. But people who are brave and vulnerable enough to be able to share that with a manager. So let's say that's the situation. You have somebody who comes to you and says, "Hey, I'm facing this, or I need some time off, to see my therapist," whatever that is. I think the very first thing that I like to tell managers is, first of all, you don't have to have all the answers. People get really scared about this topic, like, what am I supposed to say and how should I respond? I think if we could teach more people just how do I show up with empathy is like the number one thing. And if you haven't seen the video from Brene Brown, it's really short. It's also kind of funny, but it's on empathy. Watch that video, because she does a really good job of explaining what that looks like and how we can show up either for people that we manage or our peers in the workplace that might be struggling with something. So I think empathy, first and foremost, is number one. That's where I would start. We can kind of keep talking more about that, but I wanted to let Sarah jump in here too.
Yeah, I think that if you are managing people, then at this point, we just need to keep on that train of progression. When we think about employee wellness, obviously this has been kind of a buzz thing for years, but it became clear that without it, you are not going to retain good people, because you have to care for your team in order for them to care about the work they're doing for you. So I only see this going further, which is one very small perk of the pandemic. We literally spent a year and a half worrying about our health, like our wellness, whether or not we would contract this horrifying virus, whether our loved ones would, if we would remain healthy and alive, has been a big part of what we've all been experiencing. So now that we've been focused on our health and our wellness, whether it's physical, mental, social, we can't stop. We can't go back to the office now to a point and have people say, okay, well, now we're just going to be work focused again and not people or culture focused. So I'm excited to see it progress. I'm excited to see the conversations as far as mental health, even sleep, be a part of how we are taking care of our teams. But just know, if you do have teams and they're saying, these are things that I'm dealing with, just continue to add more and more offerings to your toolkit, because there are going to be so many people who not only need them, but will now feel more comfortable utilizing them.
Yeah, and I think this is a really time that we're seeing this shift towards hybrid work environments. And I wonder if either of you or anyone that is here in the chat, a lot of companies are trying to look at what does what do wellness benefits mean when part of our team is distributed and part of our team is in the office, and how do we create safe cultures around that in a hybrid work environment? We're coming out of a lot of companies were all remote, and now we're kind of moving into this area of integration on that. So so I guess I'm curious, either of you or if anyone here has examples of what their companies are doing.
It's so interesting to watch this right now. I mean, I came from a co-working environment, so that was already an environment where hybrid work models were being embraced, where people were able to have this, I think, good blend and balance of both personal and professional life. But it's going to be very interesting. I also think it really comes back to the culture and the values of each company. So again, highly individualized in terms of what people are dealing with. I think, another thing that I tell companies when they're first starting to get into like, how do we make sure mental health is showing up more in the workplace is, first of all, just be familiar with what you have. It's surprising that, looking at the EAP to find out, like, what are we offering our employees and what does this look like? And are we even doing a good job communicating this so that we know, or we can let our people know that we actually do have some benefits in place for you to access, and then making it part of the culture too. Whether, a lot of companies for a long time have been doing Wellness Wednesdays or incorporating, these types of things into the workplace. And I think that's where, Sarah has done a great job of going to companies and talking about the importance of sleep. So the more that we can see those companies show up and start to bring in these different wellness dimensions, I think that's really important. And, how are we speaking holistically to the people? Because we're asking these people to show up to be using their brains all day long very effectively. And so it's really important that we take care of that across the board. So I think looking at, like, what do we have in place first? And then asking your team, putting an anonymous survey out there to find out what are the needs that people have. Do they need more flexibility? Do they need more benefits? Do they need more access to specific resources? Do they need more education on a topic? I think really listening to your team, and then really being serious about doing that, and making that show up in ways that make people feel like they're heard.
A wonderful resource for even just the idea of culture within your workplace. It's a book. It's called Like a Boss by Nancy Lyons. So most of you Minnesotans probably know Nancy. She's an amazing leader. But this is a book that kind of discusses the importance of caring for your people as whole people if you want your workspace to be as productive and happy as possible, because there's no longer work-life balance. Our life happens and we bring that to work because it's a part of who we are. We bring our work home because it happened. And again, it's all holistic. So it's no longer a separate thing. It's, you got to care for your employees all the time.
And I think culture is a really big piece of it too. And, again, if you are a leader or manager, modeling that behavior. So I know a CEO of a local organization here, and his team knows that, every Wednesday at 1:00 he sees his therapist. So that in and of itself is modeling vulnerability and the importance of taking care of ourselves. So maybe you don't feel comfortable sharing that level of detail, but it could even be in your one-on-ones with people, is talking about, hey, what have you been able to get some rest this week? What does rest look like for you? And just making that part of the conversation and a part of the work culture are simple, easy, free ways that we can start to incorporate more of this into our lives. I realize we've been talking a lot about workplace here, but I think, we can do it in our broader communities as well, or in our families. What does that look like for each of us? Because rest in and of itself is very personalized.
I agree. And I think that one of the things that we see so often in the work, the role of leadership, right? And the role of leadership in modeling some of these things, right? We've all, maybe not all of us, but a lot of us have had the experience of being in an environment where, we're saying, oh yeah, take your vacation, but your boss doesn't take vacation, or your boss over exerts, and so even there's that difference between, like, oh, this is what is stated as a company value and this is what's practiced, right? And so as a leader, we're like practicing healthy work-life balance, for lack of a better term, I think is so important. And it's the role of a good leadership, right? We did have a couple questions come through here. Teresa wants to know, how can people reboot mixed up sleep schedules? Sarah, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, so there are so many conflicting ideas that are being kind of kicked out from the medical community. So sadly, with sleep medicine, it's very young. We really have only learned everything that we know about sleep in the last 40 years, because we finally have the technology to do it and the interest, because we now know how important it really is. So that being said, your reboot, the next time you're going to reboot your circadian rhythms or your sleep-wake cycles is when you fall very ill. That is when our body then has kind of a cellular reset. And that's why you spend so much time in bed when you're sick. It is when your body says, okay, so we're literally going to knock you flat on your back because you are now sleep deprived, which it diminishes your immune system, which allowed you to become sick with something in the first place. And then it's going to start over. Now, I'm not hoping that you get sick. There are other things that we can do to kind of work yourself out of where you are. And that really does start with habits for most people. Now, when we talked about blue light earlier and how it does bring us that joy, but it is such a big part of our lives, that is what we consider the number one negative influencer on our sleep right now. So if you are looking for a reboot, if you feel like you've already gone down a path of something that you cannot fix, you absolutely can. It just needs to start with prioritizing better habits. And the cool thing about our sleep habits is that it does not take long for us to adapt to them. So most habits take, 28 days to really stick. We see that sleep habits change within 4, 5, 7 days because we're also sleep deprived. Our bodies are literally craving these changes. So start with having some good habits. There are a lot of them on the National Sleep Foundation website, and I know you've probably seen them all too. We're all, again, on the internet all the time. You know that you're not supposed to drink coffee after noon, or, you're not supposed to drink too much alcohol right before bed. You're supposed to get 8 hours of sleep. You're not supposed to use your cell phones before bed. All these things are true. We're not trying to be mean. They're very impactful in a bad way for your sleep. So just start with a week of changing a few habits. In fact, all of those are good ones. An hour before bed, start having a nice bedtime routine. Start doing things that are calming to allow your brain the ability to release those sleep-inducing hormones. And turn off your cell phones, all of this stuff an hour before bed. Historically, we were never as chaotic as we are before bedtime. Historically, we had that time to wind down, to really relax, to get our bodies prepared for initiating sleep. And we don't do that anymore. And it instead is being replaced with technology and worry. So just, find a couple of good habits that you can really kind of change and stick to, and do it for a week. And you're not going to need to get sick to reboot your circadian rhythms. You're going to start on this path of getting better sleep, and it's going to encourage you to continue doing it, because those are awesome mornings. Those mornings where you wake up and you're like, oh my God, I slept amazing. Today is going to be great. We have the ability to do that more often. It really, for most of us, is just changing a few habits.
That's great. There's another one that is kind of related. Well, I'm curious if you have any additional information. So Mark wants to know, is it possible to reverse some of the adverse effects of not sleeping well just by prioritizing quality sleep?
Yes, absolutely. So sleep deprivation is fascinating. It's almost like smoking. And we see that once you stop smoking, immediately your lungs start to self-repair once that damaging chemical is removed. And it is similar with sleep deprivation. Once you start having better habits, you are going to work yourself out of that sleep debt. You're going to be less sleep deprived, and really, again, with your immune system, prevent yourself from getting sick and therefore continuing on that cycle. So absolutely prioritize your sleep for a week, and it's going to be amazing what you can change. It really is sad how we've all adapted to fatigue. We've all gotten used to just being tired all the time, and that's not how it's supposed to be. We've been convinced that our rest is something that is equal to laziness. And Lori and I were discussing earlier how, the only people who don't benefit from you being tired are you. If you are fatigued and you're walking around in this fog, if you don't allow yourself that ability to rest, everybody else benefits, like the healthcare system, because you will get sick and they will financially benefit from you not caring for your rest. So we were even joking about how if it's necessary, consider your rest as an act of defiance. You will be defying society by saying, no, I actually care about myself enough to get the proper sleep, to give myself that space and that allowance to rest, because it does not mean you're lazy. It means you're a human being who requires 8 hours of sleep to feel rested every night, and that's what you deserve.
I love that. Lori, is there anything that you would add to that when, we talk about Sarah was touching on the changes in the body that happen, once you kind of improve your sleep. I'm curious, in your field, is there a similar thing that you're seeing when people move to more moderate, whether it's they're cutting out different substances or bringing back to a level of moderation? Are you seeing things in the body that, and if so, what's that duration of time?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And again, I'm not a doctor, so but what we do see obviously is anytime we're taking any type of substance, that's having an impact on our brain. And there are plenty of people out there that are able to moderate. There's nothing wrong with having a glass of wine or getting together with friends or family for a cocktail as a way to relax and enjoy the social company of others. It's when individuals are not able to really turn that off, and that's where we start to get into substance use as an actual disorder. It is actually an illness. It is not a moral failure. It is not a choice to become addicted. It is a brain disease that needs treatment, just like any type of other illness that we step through. So there are certainly people that are able to make that choice to moderate their alcohol because they don't have, whether it's a genetic disorder or a genetic, it's tied to genetics or environmental things. We won't get into all of that right now. But it's something definitely, to be aware of in terms of if you are turning to substances to cope with some of those prickly feelings or uncomfortable situations. I always say to people, be aware of that. Be aware of how that's impacting you physically. As Sarah said, it definitely impacts your sleep. It definitely impacts the way that we even navigate through our life and our relationships, in our work, whatever that means for you. And sorry if there's some background noise. My neighbors are putting in a new retaining wall, and I think they're done with lunch break. Anyway, so I think that it's really important to understand what impact is it having on you physically, just to understand, like, are you okay with the restless nights of sleep, or what is that doing to you long term? Mm-hmm. I think the thing where we really want to be conscious and make sure people have support is this a situation where I am starting to realize I'm hiding this from the people in my house? Or, I'm isolating and using substances as a way to cope with some of these feelings when we know there are healthier advantages out there. So there's a lot of self-awareness that goes into that in terms of identifying, that coping mechanism as something that is, hey, I am somebody who is able to moderate this, or I'm somebody that's not, and I probably need to be really mindful of that.
Yeah, I'm curious what you would have as advice for, I'm thinking again with people managers, right? So if you have someone who is managing people and you suspect that either, I think this person is experiencing a lot of burnout or struggling with rest or sleep, or struggling maybe even with substance use, what advice would you give to that manager to have that first conversation?
Yeah. So this is something when I'm working with families too, especially to use this tactic. First of all, we have to remember no shame, no blame, no guilt. We have to really make sure we're coming at this from a place of empathy and to be curious about their behavior. So a lot of times when we see people that maybe they're, acting funny, or they're acting out of sorts, or they've missed work 3 days in a row, whatever it is, we tend to look at that behavior and place judgment on it. And that's when we start to get into trouble. So if we can ask ourselves as managers, what's the why behind that behavior that I'm seeing? What are the reasons for why they're showing up late? Or what are the reasons that they might be struggling with substances? Then we can start to have more of a collaborative conversation with that. So it's really important to stay very fact-based. And so noticing, hey, I've noticed that you've been late for 3 days of work this week. What's going on? It can be as simple as that. So you're not putting your opinion on it. You're not shaming the behavior, but you're just kind of observing. Here's what I've observed. And I'm curious to know if there's something more behind that maybe you need some help with. It's that's kind of where a good conversation could start. And sometimes people might say, no, there's nothing going on. And we have to respect that. But at least it's already communicated to them that, okay, this person is concerned about me. They're not just brushing over this. So, but hopefully people would say, actually, yeah, I am dealing with this. And then that's where, we work with people to say, well, let's figure out the right resources. How do we connect them and make sure that this is a safe place? And I think that's the other thing. If you've already done a good job at your, whether it's at work or in your community at home, like you've created safe spaces for people where they can show up and they feel comfortable enough to have these discussions, that's a really positive win off the bat. Because we need to be in relationship with people sometimes before we can bring up these topics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Sarah, is there anything that you would add?
Nope, that's definitely Lori's lane.
Yeah. Well, another question that came up was, I have someone in my life that I'm worried about and they refuse to get help for their mental health. What should I do?
Mm-hmm. So this can be a really hard one as well, because as the person that we care about, whether it's a colleague, a friend, or a family member, it's very clear to us what they should do. It's very clear the pathway that they should be on in order to get this addressed. But a lot of times that person is just not ready for change. And they may be in a stage where they haven't recognized that they have an issue, or they're in denial about something, or they just don't want to change. We see this a lot with family members and somebody who is experiencing substance use. They love their life. They're fine. They don't want to change, but it's really painful for everybody else. So the first thing we have to realize is that, again, we have to get curious about the behavior. Once we can understand why somebody is struggling with whatever that may be, it starts to make room for more compassion and empathy to have those conversations. The other thing is that we really do have to meet them where they're at. We can't force somebody to do anything. We really can't. But what we can do is we can modify our behavior that hopefully will have impacts on our person that, again, makes them feel seen, heard, and listened to and valued, so that they do feel safe enough to open up to say at some point, I am ready to get help. So one of the phrases that I like to use and that I have used in my relationships before is, if and when you're ready to get help, I'll be here to support you. And I think that communicates a lot, because it takes away that, you really need help. You should really see a therapist. If you don't get help now, the situation's going to get a lot worse. And that's just piling on the shame and guilt that people already probably feel. So it's our role as somebody who can get them help to create a relationship that makes them feel safe when they are ready to do that.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Sarah, you talked a little bit about the recommended steps to getting better sleep, right? You identified the, caffeine consumption, routine, distancing from technology before bed and all that stuff. I'm curious, in your work, you've probably seen people that have had chronic issues with sleep. How does that manifest itself in other parts of the body? Or is there like diseases that are associated with poor sleep? Or what do you see as like commonalities with people that are struggling with sleep?
So again, it's different for everybody, but what is the same is that you will become unhealthy with sleep deprivation. How it manifests in your specific body, time will tell. The CDC classified shift work as a probable carcinogen a few years ago, something that's likely to cause cancer, because after one night of 5.5 hours of sleep, our cancer-fighting cells, our natural killer cells, reduced by 70%. So they're finding the cancer incidences in this population, shift workers, people who work overnight, rise exponentially, because it's more difficult to get consolidated sleep during the day. I'm not saying if you're sleep deprived, you're going to get cancer. I'm saying what we're finding is that if there are so many things we never realized that sleep deprivation can lead to. Dementia, neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, these beta amyloid proteins that build up that are kind of washed away during sleep. When we are sleep deprived, they don't wash away as much, and that buildup is what causes this neurodegeneration. Sleep deprivation could also cause a lot of different cellular structures to start to deteriorate. We need each individual cell. Every cell in our body has its own circadian rhythm, its own little time clock for how it's supposed to work and how it works within our other systems. So it is the most vital part of caring for our bodies as a whole that we could really pay attention to. So yes, absolutely know that the less sleep you get, the less healthy you will be, period. Another thing that's not frequently discussed, though, is the prevalence of actual sleep disorders. There are over 115 classifiable sleep disorders. And it's always a person with a sleep disorder who doesn't think that they have it. There's so much more common than people realize. So if you are tired all the time, sadly, sleep disorders used to be frequently misdiagnosed as mental health issues. People would go to their doctor and say, oh, I can't get out of bed, I'm depressed, I'm tired all the time. And they'd say, here's some Xanax. Because we didn't realize that there's something else in our sleep that needs to be treated. Common things like insomnia, which could be acute or chronic, restless leg syndrome, which is a really uncomfortable nerve disorder, obstructive sleep apnea, when you stop breathing at night. All of these things can be issues that are present but unnoticed because of that adaptation to fatigue. So if you are tired all the time and you do have good habits, you should definitely speak with your primary care physician and think about getting a sleep study, because if you do have a sleep disorder that is undiagnosed, you're never going to feel rested until it's treated.
Oh, that's huge. I want to remind people that we have about 9 minutes left. So if you have any lingering questions, now is the time to drop them in either the chat or the ask a question section. So is there something, Sarah, and this actually could go to both of you. I heard somewhere that there are sometimes, whether it comes from substance use disorders or other places, is there a time where some of these can affect sleep in a semi-permanent or permanent state, like a, difficulty to access the REM cycle or anything like that? Or are there situations that are irreversible when it comes to sleep, or can it all be rebooted, as you said?
Well, we haven't seen that. Obviously, if there's a traumatic brain injury or a TBI, then neurologically your brain isn't able to go into different stages of sleep. That's one thing. But a lot of times also medication use that can come from treatment for mental health issues can be impactful. But again, we've seen just removing them from the system is going to have that huge impact. It is something that people probably worry about more than they need to, because our sleep is fascinatingly effective. We all have our Fitbits and our Apple Watches, and we pull up our sleep report in the morning and it shows the different stages you went in. Don't take that too seriously. I have people who come to me all the time and say, oh, I only got an hour of REM last night. Well, first of all, it's probably not accurate, because we cannot read your brain waves without electrodes. We don't know what stage of sleep you're in without being able to read your brain waves. So these are really more what we call motion monitors, motion detectors. They pick up your motion. They give a pretty good guess based on heart rate variability, temperature, and that kind of stuff, what stage of sleep you're in, but you're fine. So if your report comes back and says, not enough deep sleep, we have mechanisms in our brain neurologically to say, we're going to rebound. We are fascinating. When, if you did have a horrible night of sleep, you're going to be going into those deeper stages much more the next night, as long as there's not something preventing that, like excessive alcohol use. So we worry a lot about our sleep in that way, but it is fascinating how it's, I read somewhere sleep is like a cat. It's you got to ignore it for it to come to you. But you'll be okay, and not to put too much worry on it, unless, again, you are doing everything right and you're still not rested. Then there is probably a sleep disorder that needs to be treated.
And on the topic of substance use, that goes to a prolonged use of time too. Obviously, the longer that we are using substances, especially in a problematic way, the longer it is going to take to reverse some of that damage. However, I will say the brain has an amazing power to heal. And so through addressing, the substance use disorder and any of that co-occurring mental health disorder, the traumas, those are usually tightly linked. So by taking the time to address those situations, the individual's brain can start to heal on a lot of the levels that Sarah was talking about.
Fantastic. Well, we're kind of coming close to time. So I'm curious, before we close out, is there anything that you really want to make sure that folks know, kind of as a parting piece of advice or resources that you really appreciate in your work?
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to quickly bring up the topic of self-compassion. And sometimes when people think this, they think self-care, which is a really important part, getting a massage or, doing those things that feel good. But self-compassion is also really important. It's an important component of rest. And those are things when we're walking through something difficult, acknowledging and naming our pain and, telling yourself this is hard and this will take time. So being honest about what's going on with your life. And then, of course, finding, a big part of self-compassion, finding support so that you're not isolated in your pain, you're not isolated in your trauma. Those are really important things so that we can get on that pathway to rest.
Perfect. Sarah, any parting thoughts that you have?
I think a great resource, again, is the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, the National Sleep Foundation. Any of these things that you can find that are accredited online about sleep are very helpful. And I guess my parting thought would be caring for yourself in that way, sleeping more, allowing yourself space for rest is not lazy. There are literally napping laws in Japan. We're just kind of behind here when it comes to understanding the importance of that part of our well-being. So if you prioritize your rest, you prioritize your sleep, everything else is going to be a little bit easier. And we don't know that because we do go through just this fog, and it's worse now. It's worse. This pandemic has been unbelievable. But again, one good thing is that there has been a focus now on our health, our self-care, our existence, really. So just continue down that path because you deserve it. You deserve to have that whole, everything. You deserve to be able to feel secure in your job and supported there, to be healthy in your home and social life. And it's just something that we've missed for so long when we've all been taught that the rat race is something we have to participate in. But I'm definitely over that. 2020 new me. So yes, just rest.
I love that. Yeah. Oh, that's a great parting thought. Well, I want to thank both of you. This was a great conversation. I feel like we could have talked for hours. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. Really, really looking forward to future sessions where we can kind of keep digging into this important topic. Is there anything either of you want to plug before we say goodbye?
I would just, I'm happy to connect people with resources, and maybe we can put those in the notes to Maria. That would be fine, either on the substance use front or the mental health front. I do workshops that are specifically geared at anybody who loves somebody that's struggling with substance use disorders. So reach out to me if that's something that you'd like to get more information on, so we can help in that area.
Fantastic.
Yes. And if you have a company that does have wellness options, my company would love to teach you guys how to sleep. So it's sleep health specialists. So go ahead and shoot me an email, and I'd love to help get your team rested.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. And I hope you have a restful and peaceful rest of your day.
Thanks,
everyone.
Bye-bye.